The US just launched a massive airstrike campaign on the Houthis. Hundreds of missiles, dozens of bombs, billions in firepower, and it's only the beginning. Backed by President Trump, this campaign is hammering targets across Yemen, sending a message not just to the Houthis, but to Iran. So how did it all start? What's the real goal here? And is this just the first step towards something much bigger? Let's get into it. Let's start with the two most recent and most devastating attacks that the US military launched on Houthi territory. The first attack was on March 16th, with the US aircraft carrier deploying several aircraft and its airborne ordnance. According to Trump, the attack was done purposefully to force the Houthis to stop their activities both in the Red Sea and against Israel. Furthermore, Trump suggested that the attack would be only the beginning of the onslaught and mentioned that hell will rain upon them. The actual scale of the attack wasn't publicized, but eyewitness imagery from the region, coupled with satellite footage, indicate that the strikes targeted multiple cities and vital military compounds across the Houthi-controlled portion of Yemen, including its largest city, Sana'a. The reports also suggest that the US hit a vital power station and military sites in the southwestern city of Taiz and attempted to disrupt the Houthis' organizational structure by attacking commonly known meeting places. The attack resulted in over 30 deaths and an additional 100 injuries, making it one of the deadliest US actions in recent years and almost completely overshadowing the attacks done by the administration of former President Joe Biden from 2023 onward. But the attack on March 15th turned out to be exactly what Trump promised, a prelude to the actual offensive. While the first strike launched on that day was one of the largest single operations recently, it would end up being only a part of the entire operation. The attacks would end up lasting for at least another 2 weeks, with sporadic bombings and air raids conducted by US forces on a regular basis. Only 2 days after the operation began on March 17th, the death toll of the attacks had already risen to 53, including 5 children, according to Houthi sources. The number of injuries was more difficult to evaluate but was believed to be in the low triple figures. The attacks were carried out day in and day out, with the jets flying on a steady rotation to keep up the pressure on the Houthi-controlled territory and continuously perform short-range bombardments using various air-to-surface missiles. However, the reports were staggered and sometimes omitted the actual number of attacks or their targets, leading to incomplete data. From more complete reports, it's possible that the US conducted over 100 or possibly even 200 distinct attacks in the span of 10 days, with the number likely to be even higher as we enter April. While the scale of the attacks might be in question, practically no corner of Yemen was left untouched by the strikes, at least in theory, with the US military being adamant about rooting out the organization from the country, albeit with limited and mixed results. Logistically, the strikes were launched from the US aircraft carrier Harry S. Truman, one of the Navy's 11 Nimitz-class carriers on active duty. The carrier has a complement of between 60 and 90 fighter and air superiority aircraft, including FA-18 Hornets, Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, E-2 Hawkeyes, and various helicopters. The Truman is stationed on patrol in the Red Sea after being redeployed there from the North Sea and the Mediterranean near the end of 2024. The carrier's position, perilously close to Yemen, showcases how much control the US Navy has over the area. The carrier's presence in the sea itself is twofold. First, it drastically shortens the distance the aircraft have to cover to perform attacks. This would normally be vital in ensuring they are not caught by the enemy's anti-air defenses. However, the Houthis don't really have sophisticated anti-air systems in place. According to some reports, a bulk of its military capability lies in mid to long-range drones and missiles, which are used to threaten Israel from afar. When it comes to defensive systems, the Houthis have most frequently used surface-to-air missiles, namely the SA-2 and the SA-6 anti-air systems, which were holdovers from the Soviet Union and were presumably obtained from Russia or Iran at one point. Neither of those countries use these anti-air defenses, as they are considered far below the curve for contemporary aerial warfare. Instead, Iran is relying on Russian-sourced S-300s and possibly S-400s, which are capable long-range systems specializing in targeting and destroying aircraft. Russia also uses the S-300s and 400s, as well as a single battery of the more advanced S-500 system, although much of its supply has been compromised by the war in Ukraine. Comparatively, the Houthis are essentially sitting ducks, as the SA-2 and SA-6 don't have modern radar and guidance capabilities to target aircraft that the US fielded in the attacks. Even more importantly, mere days after the strike campaign started, the US reportedly moved another aircraft carrier into the Red Sea. This doubled the available aircraft fleet to up to 180 vehicles, which could significantly improve the rate and frequency of strikes. But how much has this cost the US Navy? Surprisingly, the answer is very little, despite the large scale of the operation and the attacks. This is due to the types of munitions that were used in the attacks. While there are no specifics on the number and types of weapons used in the attacks in March beyond the fact that the US Navy used carrier-borne jets, the Navy did reveal some information about the ongoing US operations against the Houthis and the entire Middle East from the start of the conflict in late 2023 to January 2025. In the statement, the US Navy used 400 munitions, mainly missiles, of which it used 120 SM-2 missiles, 80 SM-6 missiles, and a combined total of 20 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, ESSM, and SM-3 missiles. All of these missiles have a combined estimated cost of around $1 billion, with individual prices ranging from $2.5 million per SM-2 to over $28 million for some SM-3 variants. The US also used Tomahawk land attack missiles, or TLAMs, which cost around $1.4 million per unit. Of course, the economy of using a $2.5 million missile on a Houthi drone that costs less than $100,000 doesn't really make sense. This is why the Navy relatively early on switched to using less expensive and more numerous Sidewinder and Hellfire missiles to shoot down drones, which the Houthis used to try and mount an attack on the aircraft carrier. The Hellfire missile costs only $115,000, which is a much more reasonable cost for a single-use munition when dealing with high-priority targets. But there's still the matter of using 400 munitions, costing the US military $1 billion. The report from 2025 suggests that the Navy could be dangerously low on ordnance, specifically the type used in the attacks so far. However, this might be an exaggeration and focusing only on the deployed munitions inside the aircraft on the carriers available to the US Navy in the Red Sea. This is due to the exorbitantly large stockpiles of air-to-surface munitions owned by the US military. A report published in November 2024 indicates that the US Navy actually has an estimated 12,000 missiles of type SM-2 in its stockpile, as well as 400 SM-3s, 1,500 SM-6s, and over 9,000 TLAMs. Out of these stocks, roughly 2,900 SM missiles and 2,800 were estimated to have been expended by the end of 2023. This still leaves stocks of thousands of available munitions, which could feasibly be used in the ongoing campaign against the Houthis and its main backers, which we'll delve into a bit later. Arguably, the pessimistic view that the US Navy might be running out of munitions only looks at the yearly production compared to the usage of these missiles. It's estimated that the US military-industrial complex produces slightly over 150 missiles per year across different types. Conversely, the US military used at least 200 of those same types of missiles in 2024 alone. With that in mind, the US is technically only running a 50-missile deficit over the course of a single year. If we extrapolate that on the estimated supply of SM-type missiles using a lower estimate of 7,000 units, the US would only expend its existing supply in 140 years. Of course, this oversimplification doesn't take into account that the US military has quotas on how many missiles it needs to keep stocked up at all times. This concept is called magazine depth and has been guiding the US policy on munitions usage throughout the campaign, even if it was never mentioned as such. The basics of magazine depth are simple. Think of it as how deep your ammunition reserves run, determining how long and how effectively you can keep fighting without needing to resupply or face shortages. Imagine a scenario where US forces enter a conflict that's more intense or prolonged than anticipated. If the military hasn't adequately invested in magazine depth, essentially stocking up and maintaining sufficient ammunition, it could face a shortage. That means fewer bombs, missiles, or artillery rounds at critical moments, potentially reducing combat effectiveness or even limiting strategic options. For the US military, magazine depth could become a significant concern, especially given the growing possibility of conflict with near-peer adversaries like China or Russia. Unlike counterinsurgency operations, a peer conflict would consume vast amounts of ammunition rapidly, highlighting the importance of having deep enough magazines to sustain prolonged, high-intensity warfare. However, this fails to take into account the breadth and variety of munitions the US produces and keeps in stock year over year. As a case in point, we can take the Patriot anti-air defense system. This is arguably one of the most expensive interceptor systems in the world, with a single launcher costing as much as $1 billion, and each missile costing between $2 and $4 million to produce. This extreme cost hasn't dissuaded the US from trying to produce as many Patriots as possible. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin have announced that they expect to produce around 740 missiles per year for the PAC-2 and PAC-3 versions of the system by 2025, with a potential production ramp-up to roughly 1,100 missiles annually by the end of 2027. To illustrate how expensive these missiles and their launchers are, the US military intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles in April 2024 as part of its ongoing effort to aid Israel. The Arleigh Burke destroyers deploy between 4 and 7 SM-3 missiles, costing anywhere between $13 and $28 million to produce, field, and deploy. This single operation involving a single-digit number of missiles is estimated to cost between $50 and $196 million. And yet it's practically a drop in the bucket when compared to the US national defense budget, which is around $850 billion for 2025. So with all of these numbers in mind and the effectiveness of the attacks, why is the US so interested in forcing the Houthis to back off? The Houthi movement has technically existed since the 1990s. However, their ambitions were largely focused inward for the larger part of their existence, trying to take over the entire country of Yemen. Arguably, they succeeded, as the Houthi movement controls roughly 2/3 of the Yemen territory, including some of its largest cities. But the movement didn't really involve itself with the ongoing animosity between Israel and Iran until relatively recently. The catalyst for the escalation was, as you might surmise, the conflict between Israel and Hamas that began in 2023. Since then, the Houthis proclaimed themselves as enemies of the Jewish state. To evoke its military presence, the Houthis used weapons provided by Iran, mainly long-range missiles and drones, to launch repeated strikes both into Israel and against ships passing through the Red Sea. Attacks against Israel were largely symbolic, as the country's Iron Dome defense, combined with the US and UK military intelligence, meant that practically all of the strikes failed to reach their intended target. The true effect the Houthis have ended up having on the conflict was interference with naval trade and blockading ships passing through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The scale of the attacks was so high, with an estimated 150 to 170 attacks performed within a year, that many companies decided to avoid the Red Sea altogether and go around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. If this persists, it's estimated that world trade could lose roughly 12% of its current value, which will be passed on to the end consumer as increased prices and significant logistical delays. The rise in maritime attacks was what really prompted the US military response we see today, at least partially. In early 2024, the US launched Operation Prosperity Guardian, a joint naval and air mission focused on protecting global shipping routes and weakening Houthi capabilities. American warships began regular patrols in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, directly countering threats to commercial vessels. This resulted in multiple clashes, with US forces intercepting and destroying Houthi drones and missile systems. At the same time, US airstrikes hit drone production sites, radar systems, and logistics centers in Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen, escalating tensions and adding a new layer to the conflict. In response, the Houthis attempted to mount their own attacks on aircraft carriers using drones. Predictably, the attacks failed, with footage from aircraft showing jets taking out Houthi drones with relative ease and practically no countermeasures. But the real target of the US attacks on the Houthis isn't actually the Houthis, but the party backing them, Iran. Iranian-Israeli relations have long been marked by hostility and deep mistrust, rooted in ideological and geopolitical divides. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Tehran has refused to recognize Israel, often calling for its destruction. In turn, Israel sees Iran as its most significant existential threat, largely due to Iran's backing of anti-Israel militias across the region. This adversarial relationship has played out through decades of proxy wars, espionage, cyber attacks, and targeted military strikes. The war between Israel and Hamas has only worsened the situation. At the heart of Iran's strategy is its support for militant groups surrounding Israel. Iran funds and arms Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad (PIJ) in Gaza, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and the aforementioned Houthis in Yemen. These groups extend Iran's reach to cover most of Israel's land borders, forming what Tehran calls the Axis of Resistance, coordinated largely by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC). This approach allows Iran to pressure Israel indirectly, using long-range missiles and drones while remaining removed from direct conflict. Many of these groups hold political power in their territories, despite operating more like terrorist organizations than legitimate political actors. Their embedded positions make them difficult to uproot through conventional warfare or foreign aid. Israel's efforts to target them risk regional escalation, something even close allies like the US and the UK have hesitated to openly support in recent years. This is partially due to the US being unable to conduct a similar strategy in its 2 decades-long war on terror in the Middle East. After 20 years of US deployments, the Biden administration was the one that called it quits and declared the war over with relatively little to show for it. This only worked to encourage the militias, as it became clear that the US could only do so much to create pressure on foreign soil. Or at least that's how it used to be before Trump's second term in office. Regardless, Iran's growing support for the Houthis signals an expansion of its strategic ambitions. Initially focused on Yemen's civil war and the Gulf region, the Houthis have become part of Iran's broader campaign against Israel. Their increased attacks are directly tied to Iran's military-industrial support, as the Houthis lack the capacity to produce advanced weapons independently. Israel itself has also frequently assaulted Iranian military sites, arms depots, and supply routes in Syria and Lebanon, aiming to disrupt the flow of precision weapons to proxies. While some strikes have succeeded, destroying infrastructure and even Russian-supplied air defense systems, Iran hasn't scaled back its support. On the other side, Iranian proxies have launched rockets, drones, and cyber attacks targeting Israeli cities and infrastructure. Hezbollah and militias in Syria have attacked northern Israel, prompting Israeli retaliation. The cycle of escalation has drawn international criticism, with Israel often accused of a disproportionate response. The most serious concerns for Israel's safety lies in Iran's nuclear program. While Tehran claims it's pursuing peaceful nuclear energy, much of the world suspects otherwise. Iran has built advanced uranium enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow, as well as heavy water reactors like Arak. All of these are theoretically capable of producing weapons-grade fissile material, with reports showing uranium being enriched close to weapons-grade levels, reducing the breakout time to produce a bomb. This is seen by both Israel and the US as an unacceptable threat, and part of the reason the US has increased pressure on Iran's regional proxies, especially the Houthis. Despite legal and diplomatic barriers, Iran's nuclear program continues. For years, international sanctions and the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, limited Iran's capabilities. The JCPOA imposed strict oversight, curbing weaponization efforts, but after the US withdrew from the deal in 2018, Iran resumed enrichment with fewer restrictions. The current level of international oversight remains unclear, further muddying the relations between Israel and Iran, as the former has no insight into the latter's progress in developing a nuclear weapon. Iran's leadership also references a religious decree from Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei that bans nuclear weapons. While this fatwa is cited in diplomacy, many outside observers doubt that it's actually being utilized and obeyed. Additionally, there's very little reason to believe that the fatwa is actually binding, as Iran could undergo yet another revolution or significantly alter its laws to amend it and continue with its nuclear weapons production. Still, signs point to Iran quietly preparing for the option of building a bomb. A review by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists noted that while Iran hasn't produced a weapon yet, it likely could do so within weeks once it has enough fissile material. Iran's nuclear infrastructure, more advanced than China's in the 1960s, could be aided by lessons or support from existing programs. Even if China has a fraction of the nuclear arsenal that the US and Russia field, the actual technology it possesses is not that far behind. However, testing a nuclear device would be hard to conceal. A nuclear test leaves clear atmospheric and geological evidence that US intelligence could detect. Iran will be forced to choose between secrecy or a public declaration, either of which risks a military response. In this context, US action against the Houthis serves as a warning to Iran. A nuclear announcement would trigger swift and overwhelming retaliation. Any move toward a nuclear weapon could lead to regime-threatening consequences, echoing the US invasions of the early 2000s. The message is clear. Iran may be able to build a bomb, but using or revealing it would cross a red line that could ignite a much broader war. And the attack on the Houthis are also a display of how much the US is willing to commit to creating an effective deterrent. If the US military is willing to shell out $1 billion and possibly much more for strikes and use 200 missiles per year on a target as relatively insignificant as a terrorist militia that failed to take over its entire country over the course of 30 years, you can imagine the length it's willing to go to destroy Iran's threats to Israel. But what do you think? Will the attacks on the Houthis only ignite an already unstable conflict? What is Trump's endgame for this campaign? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and thank you, as always, for watching.